after Duncan Pritchard obtained his PhD from the University of St. Andrews, he was visiting professor in Aarhus and Helsinki and professor of philosophy at the University of Stirling. Since 2007, Pritchard is chair in epistemology at the University of Edinburgh, and his research interests reach from various topics in epistemology to the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of religion. And as you can see from his list of publications, Duncan Pritchard is an undisputed expert when it comes to skepticism, and therefore I have to mention at least two of his publications. The first is, of course, Epistemic Luck from 2005, and the second is forthcoming from Princeton University Press, the product of a lecture series. It's called Epistemic Angst, Radical Skepticism and the Groundlessness of Our Believing. This is related to what we will hear now. The title of his talk is Two Conceptions of Radical Skepticism.
Thank you very much, it's very kind. And thanks very much to the organisers for inviting me to come and speak. I should say that philosophically speaking, skepticism, it's both my first love and my true love. It's what got me into philosophy, and it's one of these topics that I just can't leave alone. I keep being drawn back into. And as was just said, I'm actually writing a book on it at the moment. Given that, though, whenever people ask me to give talks, I very rarely, if I have the choice, talk about skepticism. And the reason for that is that over time I find my view has become increasingly convoluted and unusual, and I think to many quite baffling. And if I try and carve off one piece of it, and like a sort of a manageable size for a talk, it becomes even more baffling, because then it's just not clear why I'm arguing for these things unless you can see what the bigger picture is. So what I'm going to try and do today is I want to connect a bunch of things that I think about skepticism together, so hopefully you can see the bigger picture. It may be no less baffling as a result, but at least you'll see the bigger picture. And this does mean that I'm going to try and cover a lot of ground very quickly, so I hope you'll indulge me. I'm going to have to paint with quite a broad brush in places and gloss over various things, but the plan is that in doing so I'll be able to give you more of a sense of where I stand here. Some preliminaries. I'm going to be focusing just on a particular contemporary variant of radical skepticism. I notice on the program, I think everyone else is doing the history of skepticism here, and I'm sort of the spectre at the feast, just focusing on the contemporary version, but that's what I'll be looking at. So when I talk about skepticism, I have something quite specific in mind, even though I'm not qualifying it. The kind of skepticism I'm going to be dealing with is concerned with radical skeptical hypotheses. I'm just going to talk about brains in vats, because that's what everybody does. Let's not get into that, it doesn't really matter for our purposes. And I'm going to talk about, just for ease of formulation, a representative, inconsistent, everyday proposition, E, which is the kind of thing, if we know anything, this is the sort of thing that we know. I'm going to be focusing on rationally grounded knowledge specifically. That's because I think, one can get into a dead end. I think in early work I got into this dead end of thinking that somehow epistemic externalism has some bearing on this debate. I don't think it does, because I think internalists or externalists ought to grant that there is a wide class of human mature knowledge which is rationally grounded, and if that's called into question by the skeptic, well, that's a problem, wherever you stand. And also, finally, I'm interested in skepticism by paradox, or putative paradox anyway, rather than a position. It's very tempting to, and this came up, of course, in the last presentation, it's very tempting when we talk about the skepticism to start talking about the skeptic and fixate on this person as if it's a position, a view that someone's advancing. I follow very much Stroud in thinking that that's the weakest way to think about skepticism. Skepticism in its strongest form is meant to be showing us that we have some fundamental commitments, very basic commitments at an epistemological level. So not pre-theoretical commitments, actually, and that they're inconsistent with one another. So it's a paradox in the traditional sense. And of course, if you think of it as a paradox, then really, whether there's anyone out there defending the skeptical position is kind of irrelevant. And whether, for example, there's something incoherent about the skeptic's position is irrelevant. As it were, the problem is all in here. It's with us. Okay, and now the structure of the talk. I'm going to be describing the two contemporary ways of spelling out this particular skeptical problem, which turn on two different epistemic principles, the closure principle and the determination principle. I'm going to be saying that these two formulations of skepticism are logically distinct. But more importantly, I'm going to say why this matters, because the mere fact that they're logically distinct, maybe nothing hangs on this. And I think most people think nothing does hang on it. I think a lot hangs on it. And I think, in fact, these two varieties of skepticism are trading on different sources. There's different underlying claims in play. Now, in an ideal world, at that point, I would then run through all the different responses to skepticism, and in the context of that, highlight my own views about this. But obviously, I don't have time to do that. So I'm going to cut straight to the chase, and I'm going to describe what I think are the two solutions we need for each of these two problems. One is a broadly Wittgensteinian response, but as we'll see, I think it's important that it's understood in a certain kind of way, and I'll talk about that. Again, if I had more time, it'd be lovely to go through all the different readings of Wittgenstein in this respect, but there's not time for that. Then I'm going to be saying that this kind of response is only effective against closure-based skepticism, and it doesn't really gain a purchase on undetermination-based skepticism, and I think there's a very good reason for that. So the antidote to undetermination-based skepticism, we have to turn to epistemological disjunctivism, which is a view that I've defended elsewhere. I think this is, as I say, the antidote to undetermination-based skepticism, but I think it gives us, at best, an awkward response to closure-based skepticism. And then finally, I'm going to talk about this synthesis, which you'll clearly see is in the offering. I have this very ugly name for it. I call it a biscopic response. If anyone can think of a better name, please tell me, because I'm running out of time. This book will go off to the printers at some point, and I thought I would have come up with a better name for the view by now. But it's meant to capture this idea, this seeing things through both eyes. So the thought is that what I want to capture is the idea that these two proposals, though they look on the face of it competing proposals, I think they're actually not only compatible, but they're mutually supportive, and I think they're entered in the same spirit. So that the thought is this isn't merely a bolting together of two things. The idea is these proposals belong together. Okay, so a roller coaster ride through contemporary skepticism. First, closure-based skepticism. I hope this will be familiar to many of you. So 3 claims. Should be pretty clear that we've got a contradiction here. They can't all be true. The third claim, straightforwardly, this is just brute anti-skeptical intuitions that we do have rationally grounded knowledge. Remember, E is the kind of proposition that if we know anything, we know that kind of proposition. The first claim is motivated by the thought that the rational support we have for our beliefs is indifferent to, doesn't speak to radical skeptical hypotheses, and hence we can't have rationally grounded knowledge of the denials of radical skeptical hypotheses. So the first claim and the third claim are meant to be sort of basic epistemological commitments that we have. Now the second claim is obviously just a bridging claim. It's just the claim we need to get the tension between the first and the third. One thing to notice about this is that I've done it in terms of cannot, the first line there, I've modalized it. Actually, we don't need that. It would be enough for skepticism just to say that you don't have this knowledge. But I think it's useful to bring that in because, of course, the skeptical claim, they're not pointing to some incidental lack on our part, such that, if only we were cleverer, more attentive, made more further inquiries or something like that, then we would have this rationally grounded knowledge. They are making the stronger claim. We actually don't need it for the purposes of the paradox. Okay, so what motivates that bridging claim? Well, the thought is that it's rooted in this principle, which I'm going to call the closure principle. One thing to highlight here is that people mean lots of different things when they talk about closure. It's very important, I think, that we have the right formulation in mind. So, lots of views which are involved in rejecting closure, which are known for rejecting closure, what they're rejecting isn't this principle. I think this is pretty much the standard way to formulate it these days. It's the sort of what's sometimes called the Williamson-Hawthorne way, because they both have defended this formulation. The idea behind it is it's a diachronic principle. And the thought is that, look, if you've got rationally grounded knowledge and you make competent deductions on that basis, thereby acquiring a belief on the basis of that competent deduction, well, then given the competent deductions are paradigm instances of rational processes, it's hard to fathom how the output of that process could not itself be rationally grounded knowledge. I mean, that just sounds mysterious, if that's not the case. Because it's a diachronic principle, we have to keep fixed that you retain your knowledge of the antecedent throughout. Because obviously, if you lost that for some reason, then that would have a bearing. It's different from the usual formulations of the old formulations of closure. It's sort of synchronic formulations like for example, that just knowledge is closed under known entailments or something like that. The trouble with those formulations is that it's very easy to come up with counterexamples. I mean, all you have to do in that case is just imagine that your belief in the consequent isn't based on your knowledge of the antecedent or the entailment, right? And then you've got yourself a counterexample. It's very hard to come up with counterexamples to this kind of principle. The thought is that this is a basic commitment of ours. The trouble is, though, if you've got that in place, then it's pretty easy to see how you're going to get your bridging claim, right? Because if you were able to have, or if you had rationally grounded knowledge of the E-type proposition, well, then you'd be able to undertake confident deductions and come to thereby have rationally grounded knowledge of the denials of sceptical hypotheses, right? By stipulation, the one entails the denial of the other. But if we've already granted that it's impossible to have that, well, then you get your bridging claim, right? So it follows insofar as one can't have rationally grounded knowledge of that one is not a brain of that, then one can't have rationally grounded knowledge of E. So we've got three claims. They're inconsistent with one another. The first and the third is like directly rooted in our basic epistemological commitments, that's the idea. And then the second is rooted in some principle, which itself is one of our fundamental epistemological commitments. And because the thought is, if this is a genuine paradox, then the only way out would be to deny, you have to be a revisionist, that's the thought. One form of revisionism might be to actually be a skeptic. So that would be skepticism qua opposition. That's embracing the denial of the third claim. But if you don't want to take that route, then you've got to deny one of the other two claims. Okay, that's the first argument. The second one, which you don't see skepticism formulated quite so often in the literature, but it does crop up from time to time, is so-called undetermination-based skepticism. Notice how superficially similar it is. We've got appeal skeptical hypotheses. Third claim is exactly the same. The second claim is just a bridging claim. Indeed, what motivates the first claim seems to be almost exactly the same as well. The thought is, well, look, insofar as the rational support we have for our beliefs doesn't speak to skeptical hypotheses, indifferent to them, well, then we can't have favouring evidence which favours the belief in E over the skeptical alternative. So again, we've got the thought that the first and the third claims are just basic epistemological commitments of ours, and then we've got this bridging claim. And as before, I've done it in terms of cannot, but we don't need cannot, so I've modalised it, but it's not necessary. And then we motivate the second claim by appeal to this principle, in this case, undetermination. Undetermination is just the thought, look, if your rational support is indifferent between two alternatives, then you can't have rationally grounded knowledge that one of the alternatives, for one of the alternatives. So the easiest way to think about this is just take the simple case of P and not P, right? So you're faced with P and not P, and you recognise that you don't have a rational basis which favours the truth of P over not P. Well, the thought is, well, then you don't have a rational basis sufficient for knowing that P, or not P for that matter. And the thought is, this is just a very weak constraint to put on whatever it is to have rationally grounded knowledge, right? And hence, something we should all sign up to. But of course, if you do sign up to that, then you can get your bridging claim, right? Because then you can say, well, if we lack the favouring evidence in the sceptical case, well, it follows that we don't have a rational basis for knowing E, right? And then scepticism ensues. So again, we've got the first claim and the third claim meant to be directly rooted in our fundamental epistemological commitments. And then the second claim is rooted in a principle, which is meant to be something which we're all willing to sign up for. Okay, so it's these two formulations that I'm interested in. Now, there was this debate that began in the noughties, started by Bruckner, and then various people like Stu Cohn and myself got involved, about the structure of skeptical arguments, these skeptical arguments in particular. And Bruckner made the point that they're logically distinct, and then people attacked this, like Cohen, and then I defended it. Let me just get the logical distinctness point over first. So, cutting a few corners here, the simplest way to show this is just by considering the relevant entailment in each case. So we keep the antecedent fixed. So I've contraposed on determination the relevant instance to get you to get the second claim. So the thought in the closure-based entailment is that from rationally grounded knowledge that E, you derive rationally grounded knowledge that of the denial of the skeptical hypothesis, not BIV. In the undetermination case, you get the same antecedent, but the consequent now is rational support that favours E over BIV. And I think when you express it like that, it becomes pretty clear that the former is logically stronger than the latter. That is, from a common antecedent, you derive a consequent which entails but is not entailed by the latter, the second antecedent, second consequent. Right, so, I mean, if you have a rational basis sufficient for knowing E and sufficient for knowing not BIV, well then obviously your rational basis must favour E over BIV, right? So you get the favouring claim. But merely going the other way, merely having favouring evidence doesn't mean that you have a rational basis for knowing not BIV, right? I mean, I could have more reason to believe one scenario over another scenario without thereby having a rational basis for knowing that the second scenario is false. Right? Some stronger claim. And I think this debate that went on in the noughties, people eventually kind of accepted that point. But I think one upshot of this was that although people thought Bruckner was right about the logical distinction in play here, they also thought that nothing really hung on it. And indeed, you might think, well, why should anything? I mean, the fact that it could be a distinction without a difference, because it could be that, well, nonetheless, if both kinds of skepticism are really trading on the same intuitions, and if whatever it takes to answer the one kind of skepticism is what it takes to answer the other kind, and vice versa, well then it doesn't really matter that there's this logical distinction in play. And I think that's a mistake, and this is one thing hopefully I'll try and convince you of today. In fact, I think that there's actually, as I say, different sources of skepticism underlying the two kinds of arguments. And this is what I want to suggest they are. So, the first claim, I think, is a claim about what I'm going to call the universality of rational evaluation, the idea that there are no in-principle constraints on rational evaluation. And I think this is what's really motivating closure-style reasoning. Because notice what happens in closure-style reasoning. It's kind of, as it were, indifferent to the contents involved. So you can go from quite local rational evaluations of your beliefs to very global, wholesale rational evaluations of your beliefs by plugging in skeptical hypotheses. And closure makes that look harmless. Maybe it is harmless, but the idea that it's harmless, I think, reflects something like this claim, the universality of rational evaluation. I think undetermination skepticism, though, is trading up on something slightly different. That is, I think it's trading on the thought that even in the best case, the rational support we have for our beliefs is compatible with those beliefs being nonetheless radically false. This is what I call the insularity of reasons. It's the idea that one's reasons, as it were, fall short, for want of a better phrase, fall short of the facts. And I think this underpins undetermination-based radical skepticism. Now, of course, these two sources might overlap and interconnect in all kinds of interesting ways, but I think once we tease them apart, we realize that what would be an answer to the one kind of skepticism might not be an answer to the other. I think you can see that by realizing that whether you accept or reject these principles is, you can accept one or the other or both or neither. And these are all possible routes here that one could take. I mean, you could imagine a certain kind of strong neo-Morean type view, for example, which agrees that there's no in-principle constraints on rational evaluation, but thinks that that doesn't pose a skeptical problem because we've got this, we do have a rational basis for excluding skeptical hypotheses, and presumably then they would reject the insularity of reason, so they'd accept the first and reject the second. And also you can go the other way as well. I think certain kinds of relevant alternative type views would say that there are in-principle constraints on rational evaluation, and for that reason they'd want to reject closure and determination type principles. But then, of course, they could accept the insularity of reasons then. Right. Okay, so there are distinct skeptical challenges being posed by these two sources of skepticism. That's what I'm suggesting. So what we should be looking for then is a twofold or biscopic solution. Okay, here's the first one I want to explore, which is a certain line of thought you get in Wittgenstein in uncertainty. Now, of course, an exegetical point. Uncertainty is fragmentary notebooks and edited by him. Some people think that there's some canonical reading and so on. I'm not of that camp. I mean, I think there are all kinds of interesting exegetical questions. I mean, it seems to be for example, the 4 notebooks, the first notebook, I think, probably is targeted on something quite different from the other 3. I think there's issues about what the inspiration for the book is. The standard line, which we get from Anscombe and von Richt in the preface, is that it's more via Malcolm, and obviously that's must be at least partly right. But when you look at the text closely, it seems to be infused with an awful lot of influence from Newman, and in particular Newman's essay Native Grammar of Send. So there's all kinds of interesting issues here about exegesis. What I want to do, though, is that I just want to pick out a particular train of thought which I think is pretty clearly present in uncertainty. And I think it concerns, I call it here the structure of reasons. It's really the structure of rational evaluation. So Wittgenstein is certainly intrigued by More's appeal to these Morean certainties, these things that we're optimally certain of. More, if you recall, has this idea, it's essentially a kind of non-classical foundationalism. So whereas normally in a form of epistemic foundationalism you have these epistemic stopping points where one can push back as being usually quite philosophical claims, cogito or something like that. More's idea is to make these common sense certainties the stopping points, right? Give them a role a point to which we can push back. Wittgenstein, though, and here I think he's following Newman, by the way. I think this is basically what Newman's arguing in Essay Native Grammar of Send. Says that actually, no, in virtue of them being optimally certain, we can't make no sense of them being rationally grounded, rationally evaluated at all. They are, as it were, the fixed points relative to which rational evaluation takes place. And that means for Wittgenstein, not only can we not rationally doubt them, but we can't have reasons for them either. I mean, a famous passage from Newman, just give you a flavour of the overlap here. It says, none of us can think or act without the acceptance of truths, not demonstrated, not intuitive, yet certain. Okay, so the thought is you have a kind of inverted foundationalism. So they are, in a sense, playing a foundation role. They are what enables rational evaluation to take place. But by that very token, they are exempt to rational evaluation themselves. Wittgenstein builds this case over time, so with a bunch of examples try and get us to see this point. One type of example focuses on the incoherence of rational doubt of these Morean certainties, trying to remind us again and again, I'm going to give you some quotations in a moment, don't worry, trying to remind us again and again of the absurdity of such doubt, of how the ground for doubt would always be more apt to doubt than the thing being doubted and so forth. And of course that's a familiar anti-skeptical line that one might take. But Wittgenstein argues that this is a point that cuts both ways. So it doesn't motivate a traditional anti-skepticism, because the thought is, just as we can make no sense of rational doubt, then we can make no sense of rational belief either. And then there's a further point which Wittgenstein emphasizes again and again, which is we can make no sense of a subject that doesn't have these commitments. They wouldn't count as believers, rational agents at all. And this is really important because what Wittgenstein is trying to say that it's not an incidental fact about a system of rational evaluation that it's structured in this way. He thinks that's just the way it has to be. There's no option here. So we get this very different picture of the structure of rational evaluation. The thought is that rational evaluation is by its nature essentially local. The idea of fully general rational evaluations, he thinks, is simply incoherent. And it's crucial that this is a point both against the skeptic and the traditional anti-skeptic, such as the Morean. Right, so the idea of a skeptical wholesale epistemic evaluation is incoherent, but so is the idea of some sort of validatory project where we evaluate our beliefs as a whole, our commitments, and then find them all to be rationally supported is incoherent. Wittgenstein also emphasizes again and again the visceral nature, the non-optional nature of these commitments. The fact that they're not acquired by rational processes, that they're essentially insensitive to rational considerations. As he says, we're not taught them, but rather swallow them down with the things that we are taught. So, no one teaches that you've got two hands. You're taught to do things with your hands, and that you've got two hands is swallowed down with things that you're taught. And so then a famous passage he says that we have to realize the ultimate groundlessness of our believing. I think Wittgenstein thinks that this is This is the cure to a certain kind of skepticism, recognizing this. So it's not meant to be a skeptical solution. It's meant to be, once we recognize that there is no alternative, then the aspiration for a fully general rational evaluation is meant to subside. Right, so here's some quotations, just to give you a flavour of things. My having two hands in normal circumstances is certain as anything I can produce an evidence for it. That's why I'm not in a position to cite in my hands as evidence for it. If a blind man were to ask me if he got two hands, I should not make sure by looking. If I were to have any doubt of it, then I don't know why I should trust my eyes. Why shouldn't I test my eyes by looking to find out whether I see with two hands what is to be tested by what? This passage always makes... So here we get the flavour of the idea, that grounds for doubt and grounds for belief are incoherent when it comes to these basic commitments. And these passages always remind me of... there's a comedy sketch in the 70s, Morecambe and Wise, and one of the people is asked whether he can play piano, and he says, I don't know. I've never tried. Let's find out. And it's the same, with hands. Imagine a child asking you whether you've got two hands. You say, I'm not sure. Let's have a look. Oh, here they are. So Wittgenstein's trying to get us to see the incoherence of that. Some more. If you try to doubt everything, you want to get as far as doubting anything. The game of doubting itself presupposes certainty. Wittgenstein would say as well, the game of believing it presupposes certainty. The certainty comes before belief and doubt. So again, this idea of these basic commitments are having to be in place before we can make sense of the idea of playing the game of rational evaluation. And then a very famous passage. The questions that we raise in our doubts depend upon the fact that some propositions are exempt from doubt, or as it were, like hinges on which those turn. That is to say, it belongs to the logic of our scientific investigations that certain things are indeed not doubted. But it isn't that situations like this, we just can't investigate everything, and for that reason we are forced to rest content with assumption. I want the door to turn, the hinges must stay put. A few things to say about this. The first off is that the hinge metaphor. I'm going to use the hinge metaphor here and now. I'm going to talk about our hinge commitments. It's not the only metaphor Wittgenstein uses. He talks about framework propositions, bedrock, scaffolding of our thoughts, and so forth. But it's the one that's sort of stuck. For reasons that hopefully will become apparent, it may not be the best metaphor to focus on because it sort of conveys an idea, which I don't think Wittgenstein is buying into, of optionality. I mean, this comes out very clearly in Michael Williams's work, obviously on natural doubts. He makes a lot of the hinge metaphor, and he says, we can imagine moving the hinges about in a door, and the door then opening in different kinds of ways. And he embraces that. I mean, the way he thinks of hinge commitments, they have a certain optionality to them, methodological necessities, as he calls them. You can choose to change disciplines, and when you change disciplines, you change your methodological necessities and so on. I don't think Wittgenstein's thinking of hinges like that. They're not optional in that kind of way. So I think in that sense, the hinge metaphor may not be the best one, but I'll use it. I'm also going to talk about hinge commitments rather than the hinge propositions, which is more common in the literature. I think the trouble with talking about propositions, it makes us sort of focus on the content, when really what we're interested in is our attitude, the particular propositional attitude in play. And then finally, this point about logic crops up here. In lots of remarks in Uncertainty, Wittgenstein returns to this. It's this thought that he wants to get us to see it's just not an incidental fact about us that our system of rational evaluation is like this. It could not be any other way. He thinks the very idea of there being a way of their doing rational evaluation which doesn't have hinge commitments in there, and which therefore is essentially local, which excludes fully general rational evaluation, he thinks that's just incoherent. So the thought is that we have to rid ourselves of the aspiration, because it's an incoherent aspiration. And indeed, what he wants us to get us to see is that what looked like a paradox isn't really a paradox once we embrace this thought, right? This is what I call the undercutting anti-skeptical strategy, because what you do is you say, skepticism looks like it's arising out of our basic commitments, ungarnished by theory, but in fact, actually something quite theoretical has been smuggled in here. And it looks innocuous, but it isn't. It's dubious, and it needs to be thrown out. Once it's thrown out, then the problem disappears. So no need for revisionism, that's the thought. You can bring this point out, I think, by comparing Wittgenstein with a certain kind of, what I think of a common sense anti-skepticism. Now, people often take Austin to be representative of this. Stroud does, for example. I'll do the same. I think it's probably unfair to Austin. But there's a way of thinking about Austin where a lot of the moves he makes are very similar to Wittgenstein. I'm thinking here about Other Minds, this classic paper. Time and again, Austin is looking at examples of how our actual epistemic practices and how they function, and then comparing them with the philosophical way with which we make rational evaluations, and trying to get us to see how very different they are. Here, famous passage here, enough is enough, it doesn't mean everything. Enough means enough to show within reason for present tense purposes, it can't mean anything else. He's talking about whether or not you know this is a goldfinch. For an alternative competing description of it, it does not mean, for example, enough to show it isn't a stuffed goldfinch. And so it's very tempting to think, what Austin's up to is the same thing as what Wittgenstein's up to. Lots of examples get us to see the oddity of skeptical and philosophical ways of thinking about rational evaluation compared with our ordinary epistemic practices. But if that's all there is to this common sense anti-skepticism, then it faces a problem. I think Stroud very nicely brings this out in his 84 book. For skepticism to be a paradox, the skeptic doesn't have to say that, as it were, the skeptical standards of rational evaluation are present in our everyday practices. Because it's open to the skeptic to say, as it were, that the way in which they're rationally evaluating our beliefs is just a purified version of our ordinary epistemic practices. I mean, so they can say, yes, of course there's a difference. But the difference comes from the fact that in everyday contexts, we're restricted in all kinds of epistemically irrelevant ways. We're restricted by time and opportunity and imagination and so on. But the thought is, when we take our ordinary practices of rational evaluation and then we just apply them in a consistent and purified way, then we end up with skepticism. So they can say, well, of course there's a difference. But it doesn't follow from that skepticism isn't, as it were, rooted in our ordinary everyday commitments. It doesn't follow, therefore, that skepticism isn't a genuine paradox. This is where Wittgenstein, if we think the characterization of Austin is right, I don't think it is, but never mind, the straw man characterization, if you think that's the right contrast to draw, this is something that Wittgenstein saw and Austin missed. Because what Wittgenstein is trying to show is that the one is not merely a purified version of the other. He wants to show, in fact, there's a discontinuity in terms of these local standards of rational evaluation and these global ones. And there's a very nice passage where he talks about doubting whether a planet exists, and then there's doubting whether Earth exists. And he says, it's not just a difference of degree here. We've shifted completely to something which we make sense of, something which is incoherent. Okay, so that's the general structure of the Wittgensteinian response. The problem with this view, however, has always been how to unpack it exactly. And there's all different proposals here which people have made. And depending on the view you go down, usually you end up having to tack on some implausible claims to it in order to get it to work out as an anti-skeptical proposal. I think part of the reason for this is that, and I think this is very true of Williams's book, for example, the Unnatural Doubt book I'm thinking of, that what he's trying to do there is get the skeptical response, the Wittgenstein's response, to work against both forms of skepticism simultaneously, without in fact distinguishing them. And I think actually, once we understand it properly, it's only really geared towards the one kind. I also think we need to recognize something about the nature of hinge commitments in order to see why the Wittgensteinian response doesn't lead to the rejection of closure. This is the point I'll now explain. So there's a closure problem for Wittgenstein's view. And Wittgenstein was aware of this. So we have this picture where you've got your ordinary non-hinge commitments can be rationally grounded, and then you've got these hinge commitments which are immune to rational evaluation. But of course the issue emerges then that, well look, the propositions at issue can stand in logical relations to one another, and the non-hinge claims in particular can entail the hinge claims. So what then is preventing me undertaking some sort of deduction and thereby coming to have rationally grounded knowledge of the hinge claims? And if, on the other hand, that's impossible, then in what sense are my beliefs of the non-hinge claims rationally grounded, right? I mean, Wittgenstein is definitely aware of this. It crops up here and there. It is certain after the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon, well, in that case, surely also certain the Earth existed then. So we have this idea that some historical claim, which is rationally grounded, entails denial of the skeptical hypothesis, that, for example, the so-called Russellian hypothesis that the universe came into existence a few moments ago, replete with the traces of a distant ancestry. Well, if we have the closure principle in there, well, then we could derive rationally grounded knowledge from the former, we could derive rationally grounded knowledge of the latter. But if we've already stipulated that there could be no such thing as rationally grounded knowledge of the latter, well, then that seems to call into question rationally grounded knowledge of the former, at least unless we don't want to deny closure. And that is one route one might take. I mean, I think, for example, Crispin Wright's view, he has a sort of what's called an entitlement reading of uncertainty. And he ends up, I mean, the terminology is slightly different. He talks about a principle called transmission, which is meant to be stronger than closure, and which he denies. But actually, what he's calling transmission is very close to what we're here calling closure. And in fact, the case he makes for denying transmission would result in denying the closure principle here. So in effect, he is denying closure. Because basically what he wants to say is that although we have an entitlement for believing the hinge commitments, which is not thereby a reason for thinking that they're true. Right? And so therefore, he's granting that we can't have rationally grounded knowledge of them. So that's one route you might go. Or other options, I mean, Williams ends up with quite a convoluted form, I think, of contextualism in trying to get around this. And so now the view unpacked starts to look less like an undercutting strategy. That's the worry. It starts to look more like something which is quite revisionary, and therefore not very much contrary to the spirit of what Wittgenstein was up to. How do we get around this? Well, I think we need to rethink our hinge commitments. This relates back to the point I was making before about the metaphor itself, and how it might not be so helpful. When you look at the kinds of examples of these Morian certainties that are in play, they look like a very heterogeneous class. You know, it's very easy, I think, to overstate their variability. And I think some people, they quite like that. You know, if you've got a certain, depending on your background, certain Kuhnian instincts, for example, you may want to embrace this feature. Williams certainly does. But I think actually once you look a little closer at what the hinge commitments are, they have a common source. And it's pretty straightforward, it seems to me. We have a basic overarching commitment. I call it Uber commitment. Of course, normally I'm not speaking to a room full of mostly German speakers when I say that, so it probably sounds very naff in this context. But anyway, an Uber hinge commitment, which is that you're not radically and fundamentally mistaken. So what you've got with these commitments, these basic certainties, they're in effect sort of everyday ways of manifesting, codifying, if you like, that basic overarching hinge commitment. And I think if you look at it this way, it's kind of a way of sort of demystifying the hinge view. Yes, there's variability, but why is there variability? It's because, well, depending on your set of beliefs, how your hinge commitments are manifested, how your overarching hinge commitment is manifested, will be very different. So you get a kind of taxonomy here. We've got the overarching hinge commitment, which then is manifested off what I call personal hinge commitments. These are quite specific claims. And then anti-skeptical hinge commitments. So these are sort of theoretically created to call the Uber hinge commitment into play. The ones that change or can be variable are really the second class. The first and the third class, the thought is everyone has those. The second class can be variable, but that doesn't mean that there's sort of huge variance in hinge commitments. It just relates to the fact that we have different sets of beliefs will manifest that hinge commitment in different ways. So, for example, one of the more uncertainties is meant to be that I've never been to the moon. We could imagine a world of the future where space travel is so common, where whether or not you've been to the moon is like asking whether or not you've been to Cologne or something like that. It could be the place you may have been to without being aware of. As your beliefs change, then your personal hinge commitments might change. But that doesn't reveal any kind of optionality in the hinge commitments. It's just, as it were, we have these basic, visceral, non-optional hinge commitments. How your personal hinges are manifest can change from time to time. It will change from culture to culture and so forth. Now, think now about the closure problem. Typically, the closure problem only really arises with the third class of hinge commitments. I mean, the first class, you're not going to get it because no individual thing that you believe is going to entail that, right? Because, I mean, what you'd need if you're going to do this is not a closure principle, but something else, a really beefed up version of closure. You need something which has got iterativity built into it, perhaps, or some sort of agglomeration principle, or maybe a track record argument, or multi-premise closure, or something like that. Then maybe you could do it. But all of these add-ons to closure are highly controversial. We've moved away from this basic principle. In fact, nearly all the ones I've just mentioned are mostly denied. So you don't get the entailment there. Same with the personal hinge commitments. I mean, I think you can get entailments here, but usually where there are entailments, you're not moving from the hinge to a non-hinge to a hinge. You're moving just between hinges. You know, that I've got two hands entails I've got one hand, but I haven't moved out of the realm of hinges here. I've just got one hinge commitment entailing another. So really, it's with the third class that the issue arises, and I think that may be significant. Okay, so what kind of view then do we end up with when we think about uncertainty? Well, I think we should embrace, some people try and resist this, but I think we should embrace the idea they're not rationally grounded knowledge. The issue then becomes what kind of propositional attitude are they? And I think on this view where we take seriously their visceral nature, their non-optionality, their animal nature, I think we should be resistant to the idea of thinking them as beliefs, or at least as what I call knowledge-out beliefs. So philosophers mean very different things when they talk about belief. There was a nice paper by Leslie Stevenson a few years ago called 6 Levels of Mentality, where he came up with 6 notions of belief, which he claimed were active in the literature. I think he missed a couple out, actually. But certainly when epistemologists talk about belief, they have in mind a particular propositional attitude, which is an attitude which is a constituent of knowing. And this particular propositional attitude stands in certain kinds of conceptual relations to truth and reasons. So, for example, it's not the kind of propositional attitude which is in principle unresponsive to rational considerations. Not the kind of propositional attitude where you would continue to have it even if you recognise you had no reason to think P is true. But of course our hinge commitments are precisely like that. So whatever propositional attitude it is, we're not to think of it as knowledge-out beliefs. Crucially, the propositional attitude we want in play here has to be such that it's incompatible with agnosticism about the target proposition. I mean, I think this is a mistake that Wright makes. He recognises this point about belief, but then he tries to bring in other kinds of propositional attitude like trust and acceptance. But they're the wrong kind of propositional attitude. They're compatible with being agnostic about P. And indeed, they're wrong on another level as well, because you're getting the optionality built back into it now. You know, one chooses to trust, one chooses to accept. That's not the way the hinge commitments work. So we end up with what I call a non-belief reading of uncertainty. We say that there's a distinctive kind of propositional attitude involved, one that, like knowledge-out belief, excludes Gnosticism about P, which, unlike knowledge-out belief, is a very different relationship to rational considerations. They're not directly acquired by a rational process, nor are they directly responsive to rational considerations. The point of the directly there is, so with the personal hinges, for example, your beliefs over time can change, and then which personal hinge commitments codify your overarching hinge commitment can change. And of course that could be a rational process, but it's not as it were directly, it's not as if your hinge commitments are being altered directly by rational considerations. It's an indirect process. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because, think back to the closure principle. Remember, it was really vital there, I said, that we had to understand this principle in a certain kind of way in order to convey why it was meant to be a basic commitment of ours. We had to think of it as something where you've got rationally grounded, competent deductions leading to beliefs which are based on that rational process. And that's the driving idea behind closure. It's that if you've got rationally grounded knowledge, you make the competent deduction, form your belief on that basis, then what comes out of that ought to be itself rationally grounded knowledge, because it would be mysterious if it were otherwise. But once we get clear that that's the idea, then it's sure to be manifest that closure is simply inapplicable to our hinge commitments. Our hinge commitments are not to be thought of as beliefs, knowledge out beliefs, much less are we to think of them as the kinds of things that could be acquired via a rational process such as this competent deduction. So once you get that thought in play, it turns out that you don't have to deny closure. All you have to do, in fact, is realize that there's a logical distance between that bridging claim in the closure-based argument and the closure principle itself. Right? So it was kind of taken for granted before the closure principle, that directly led to that bridging claim. But in order to make it so relate, you have to buy into this idea, universality of rational evaluation, the very idea that Wittgenstein's rejecting. And I think taking that seriously means taking seriously the thought that the hinge commitments aren't to be thought of as the sorts of things that can be plugged into closure-type inferences. So the thought is, it's not closure that's amiss. That bridging claim is false, and it's false because you can't use closure to derive it. And I think this gives us a fully undercutting response to the radical skepticism. So remember, there's three claims in play. The first and the third were meant to be derived from our basic epistemological commitments. Well, we've accepted both of those. The second one wasn't, it's just a bridging claim, but it was meant to be derived by closure, which was part of our fundamental epistemological commitment. And the thought is, well, we're not denying closure, we're just denying the bridging, we're just saying the bridging claim isn't generated by it. So I think you get a very elegant way of dealing with closure-based skepticism. The problem, however, is that I think you can't straightforwardly extract, without bolting something else on, a response to undetermination-based skepticism from this line. And the reason for that is that, rational evaluation could be essentially local, and rational support could be essentially insular, it could be in the way I specified earlier. There's nothing in the former which excludes the latter, right? If you try and get some denial of the latter out of the former, then I think what you end up doing is bringing in further components, and I think then you end up with some kind of revisionism. I think a good example of this is Michael Williams, because he runs both in actual doubts, both problems get run together, and then we end up with lots of quite strange views coming out. I think the right thing to do is to realize that the Wittgensteinian response is really to one source of skepticism, the universality of rational evaluation, and not to the other. I think we should look for the solution to undetermination-based skepticism elsewhere. Okay. Oh, sorry. Wrong. That was a slide that was meant to be up just now. Sorry. So there, yeah. So this is the point I was just making. You don't have to deny closure, we're just denying universal rational evaluation. It's undercutting, but it doesn't give us any purchase on undetermination-based skepticism. Okay, so what is the solution then to the other problem? I think here we need to turn to a different kind of view, a view I call epistemological disjunctivism. So this is a book I had out recently. The epistemological disjunctivism is, so the view is inspired by McDowell's work, but well, certainly there's lots of things I'm signing up to that he doesn't, so it's probably better to think of it in its own right. What prompted me to write the book was that it seemed to me that this position was, well, basically, contemporary epistemology just takes it as given that the position is simply unavailable. To the extent that, for many years, I couldn't even explain to people what the view was, because when you try and explain to people, they just thought they must have misheard you or something like that. It can't possibly be right. You might be a different audience in this respect. I mean, this could be just a fact about the contemporary epistemologists. It may be historians are more susceptible. People who do history of skepticism are more susceptible to this idea. But in any case, it was regarded as anathema. The goal of the book then was to try and show that the view was defensible. And there's basically three stages to this. The first stage was to say that epistemological disjunctivism was rooted in our ordinary ways of thinking and talking about rational evaluation, reasons. The second claim was to say that we only reject the view because for theoretical reasons we think that the view is simply incoherent, it's unavailable. And I try in this regard to show that those reasons for rejecting the view are all bad reasons, right? So the view is defensible at least. And then the third thing I do in the book is try and show that the view is desirable. So if it were available, you'd want to have it. And I try and do this without appealing to any further theses that epistemologists, contemporary epistemologists would find controversial. That was the challenge I set out for myself. So what is the view? It's the idea that in paradigm cases of perceptual knowledge, the rational sport one's belief and joys can be both factive and reflectively accessible. This is the claim that's anathema to contemporary epistemology. The thought is, well, insofar as we're talking about reflective rational support, then we can't be talking about something that's factive. That's just it's just incoherent to have those two together. In particular, it's the claim that the rational basis can be that you see that P, or seeing that P, the claim goes, is rational support's genuinely reflectively accessible, so it's not qualified in any way, but of course it entails P. And of course, if epistemological disjunctivism is correct, it's in direct conflict with the insularity of reasons thesis. I mean, it would block undetermination-based skepticism right from the off, because you just wouldn't get that opening claim. You wouldn't get the opening claim. Now, I'm not going to be able to do justice to this here, but I said there were some reasons why people find the view crazy. There's quite a lot of them, actually. I'll just briefly mention three and maybe give you a sense of what I say about them. I mean, one kind of issue is what you might call an access problem. I think people think, look, if you've got reflectively accessible factive reasons, doesn't that give you a reflective route to knowledge of specific empirical facts? You might think it's a kind of like a version of the McKinsey worry. You know, the McKinsey worry about combining first-person authority with certain kinds of content externalism. The thought is if you combine them, then you get a priori route to know facts of the world. You get, from the fact that you're thinking water thoughts, you can derive the fact that water exists, on a purely a priori basis. You might think something similar is going on here. I think this is a red herring. The reasons in question are empirical reasons from the off, so there isn't a purely reflective route. Plus, in the cases in which you have the factive reason, there are also cases in which you have the empirical knowledge of the P. So you've already got the empirical knowledge. The idea that you have a reflective route to know P through some non-empirical means is just not plausible. I think there might be a deeper thing here, though, which I call the distinguishability problem, which is that it seems everyone ought to accept, so the thought goes, that we can't perceptually tell the difference between the good and the bad case. So the good case is the paradigm case for our purposes. The bad case would be the skeptical case for our purposes. I mean, that just seems to be like a datum, that we can't perceptually tell the difference. But of course, suppose we grant that it's datum for the purposes of this problem. Then the thought emerges, well, hang on, if you're epistemological disjunctivist, surely there is something reflectively available to you in the good case, which isn't available to you in the bad case. So in the good case, at least, it seems you ought to be in a position to come to know that you're in the good case, and therefore come to know the good case rather than the bad case. I think that that's right, actually, but I think once you understand it correctly, I think it comes out as quite harmless. This gets complicated, so basically what I do here is I appeal to a distinction, which I think all epistemologists should grant, between what I call favouring epistemic support and what I call discriminatory epistemic support. I think you can be in a situation where you have better reason to believe in one scenario or another, even though you can't perceptually discriminate between the two scenarios. So, you can have better reason for thinking that's a zebra rather than the clever disguised mule because, let's say, you've got lots of background information about the zoo and the zoo owner or what have you, even though you can grant, you couldn't be able to tell the difference. You have no special expertise to tell the difference between zebras and clever disguised mules. I don't think there's anything particularly controversial about that distinction. But I think once you apply it to epistemological disjunctivism, well, then there could be that there are ways of knowing the difference, which aren't thereby ways of perceptually telling the difference. And maybe that appealing to one's factive reasons is just like that. So I think, so construed, this problem ends up being quite harmless. A third kind of problem, which I think is related to the second, is, well, look, even if there's such factive rational support's available, surely dialectically one can't, it's not citable, as it were, you can't use it. Certainly not use it with regard to the skeptic. But I think here, there's, not only is this not true, it could well be this is the only kind of rational support that you can appeal to legitimately. Remember, skepticism is a paradox. It's not a position. The skeptic is not saying, they're not giving you reasons for thinking you're a brain devout or for any other skeptical hypothesis obtained. They're just simply introducing you. I think when error possibilities are rationally motivated, they act as defeaters, right, until they're in turn defeated. But merely raising an error possibility doesn't make it a defeater. it's not enough. That's not enough to take you out of the good case. I mean, if it did take you out of the good case, there wouldn't be a problem here, because then you wouldn't have the factive reason anyway. But insofar as you're still there in the good case, well, then I think you can cite factive reasons. And the reason I say maybe that's the only thing you can cite is that whereas there might be something incoherent about citing non-factive reasons, because they're the kinds of reasons that are available even to the brain of that, of course the factive reason is something which isn't available to the brain of that. So it is the kind of thing that would make sense to cite. Okay, so that's just the gist of some of the problems and how I go about trying to deal with them. Okay, so the thought then is, suppose you grant that epistemological disjunctivism is a viable view, well then it follows the opening claim is false, right? So you do have a better rational basis. In the good case, at least, you have a factive rational basis in the good case. And the thought again, notice this is an undercutting anti-skeptical strategy. So the thought is that ordinary ways of thinking and talking about offering reasons, it involves citing factive reasons, unless, you take yourself not to be in the good case. And we abandoned this, so the thought runs, because, we thought that theoretically we could make no sense of this position. If it turns out that we can make sense of this position, then, as it were, we return to a sort of state of innocence. It turns out, as it were, the skeptical paradox is trading on theoretical claims. It's smuggling in theoretical claims, which are masquerading as common sense. But epistemological disjunctivism gives you at best an awkward response to closure-based skepticism. Now, in the book, since I didn't want to appeal to anything else controversial, I just went ahead and applied it to closure-based skepticism as well. And so you end up with a pretty strong view, what seems like a quite epistemically immodest view. You have to say you've got rationally grounded knowledge of the denials of skeptical hypotheses. And I think that it jars somewhat. But more importantly, I think once you realise that we've got two problems in play here, then I think you no longer feel the essential urge to have epistemological disjunctivism deal with both versions of the skeptical problem. And in fact, I think the right way to go is to wed epistemological disjunctivism to the Wittgensteinian view. That's Lynceus, by the way. This is where you get the bioscopic proposal. Lynceus, one of the Argonauts, famously Aristotle said that he was the only person who he saw the elements unmixed, everyone else saw things mixed. So it's this thought, you just need two eyes to see things correctly. So if you think they're inherently logically distinct problems, no reason to expect a common solution. If we think the Wittgensteinian line is designed for closure-based skepticism, the undetermination-based line is designed for undetermination-based skepticism, then the issue just becomes, well, to what extent can we bring these two together? Now, at bare minimum, you need them to be compatible, of course. And you might think, well, they look very different proposals, look competing. One's about factive reasons, as it were. The other one's about the locality of rational evaluation. But I think once you start to think it through, not only are they compatible, but they're mutually supporting and in the same spirit. Compatibility, there's nothing in the idea of rational evaluation being essentially local that excludes factive rational support in paradigm cases. There's nothing in the idea of factive rational support in paradigm cases excluding the thought that rational evaluation is essentially local, so they're definitely compatible. Mutual support, well, of course, they're mutual support. One direct form of mutual support is the fact that you now get an answer to both problems, and of course you take the pressure off each of the anti-skeptical approaches. Indeed, I think it's even stronger than that, the mutual support. It's easier to live with the idea of rational evaluation being essentially local if, paradigmatically, it's factive. And I think it's easier to live with the idea that rational evaluation is factive if we think that rational evaluation is essentially local, because we don't have... So, for example, in the second case there, we're not committed to think we have rationally grounded knowledge of the denials of skeptical hypotheses now. We can resist that conclusion. And of course, they're in the same spirit. Both of them are undercutting anti-skeptical strategies. Both of them are trying to show that what looks like a paradox isn't really a paradox, that it's trading on these dubious theoretical claims. And I think that's quite important, because if one of them was revisionary and the other one wasn't, then I think they would make awkward bedfellows. But actually, I think they work very well together. Thanks very much. Sorry, that was very long.